There's a silent war waged inside every single man every single day. It ain't fought with bullets or bombs, and you won't read about it in the morning paper. The battlefield is quiet, hidden, tucked right in between a man's ears. It's the constant, grinding conflict between giving up and finding a way, between letting life happen to you and deciding, no matter what, you're gonna happen to life. And in that relentless, unseen struggle, my friends, the invisible line that separates a man who barely scrapes by from a man who truly builds something meaningful, that line is drawn with the hard, unyielding grit of mental toughness. It's the difference between a life of quiet resignation and one of determined progress. It's the whisper that tells you to keep going when every fiber of your being screams to just stop, to surrender, to accept whatever meager hand you've been dealt. It's a battle of wills, a daily referendum on your own resolve, and the stakes are higher than most folks ever realize, touching not just your own peace, but the very future of those you love. For the longest time, Hector, a man carved from the same rough stone as 1,000 other working souls, fought that silent war without ever truly knowing he was even on the battlefield. 48 years old, he was a factory man, plain and simple, his existence measured in the relentless clatter and hum of giant machines, the rhythmic thud of presses, and the slow, agonizing creep of the clock toward quitting time. He wasn't one for grand pronouncements or flashy gestures. His life was a testament to quiet endurance, a methodical march through the days, weeks, and years. You saw it in his face, a roadmap of quiet struggles and burdens carried with steadfast, almost stubborn resolve. Lines fanned out from the corners of his eyes, not just from laughter but from long hours of focus under fluorescent lights, and from a deeper internal tension that pulled at his brow. His eyes themselves, a faded hazel, often seemed to be looking at something far off, something just beyond the factory walls, or perhaps something he'd left behind many years ago, a dream gently folded and tucked away for safekeeping, yet never forgotten. There was a weariness there, a profound tiredness that sank deeper than just lack of sleep, an exhaustion of the spirit that sometimes made him seem distant, preoccupied even when standing right beside you. Yet, underneath that weariness, if you look close enough, you might catch a flicker, a stubborn ember of something unyielding, a core of quiet strength that hadn't entirely given up. His hands, though, they told the clearest story of all. They were thick, powerful hands, not soft and manicured, but raw and honest. Knuckles were scarred from countless minor collisions with metal and machinery. Calluses like armor plated his palms, a testament to decades spent gripping tools, wrestling heavy parts, pushing levers that resisted with the stubborn might of industrial steel. These were hands that had built things, yes, had earned every penny he'd ever brought home, but they were also hands that had quietly carried burdens too heavy to share, burdens that pressed down on his shoulders and weighed on his mind, though he would never complain. When he wiped grease from them with a rag at the end of a shift, there was a kind of solemn ritual to it, washing away the grime of the day but never quite the unseen residue of worry. He moved with a certain stoicism, a deliberate, slightly heavy gait, the kind of man who'd help you lift a stubbornly stuck crate without a word, his muscles flexing under his worn work shirt, then just as silently disappear back into his own thoughts, leaving you to wonder what invisible weight he was always shouldering. At the lunch break, while other men bantered about sports or argued politics, Hector would often sit a little apart, unwrapping his sandwich, his gaze drifting over the bustling floor, seeing perhaps not the machines but the years they represented. He was dependable, fiercely so, a man whose word was his bond, who never shirked a task or left a job unfinished. But that dependability came wrapped in a protective layer of reserve, a quietude that others sometimes mistook for indifference, but was, in truth, a habit born of internalizing every problem, every fear, every silent doubt. For Hector, asking for help or even just voicing a complaint felt like a confession of weakness, a crack in the sturdy facade he presented to the world and, more importantly, to himself. It was a flaw that isolated him, that left him to wrestle with his struggles alone, fueling a quiet ambition for a life with less stress, yet leaving him stuck in a constant, solitary battle with the fear of never truly being enough. There are men, you see, who spend their lives believing that circumstance is fate, that the rough road they travel was laid out for them, and all they can do is put one foot in front of the other until they run out of track. They blame the economy, the boss, the lottery numbers, the hand they were dealt, for the way their life turned out. They carry the weight of the world on their shoulders, but the heaviest burden isn't the one they lift with their backs. It's the one that settles between their ears, a quiet narrative that tells them this is all there is. And for a long time, that narrative runs their whole show. Then there are other men. Men who, for reasons they don't always understand themselves, refuse to let that story be the end of it. Men who, through some grit or grace, discover that the real difference between just getting by and truly living, between staying stuck and finally breaking free, isn't about the world outside, but the world within. It's about what you tell yourself, day in and day out, when nobody else is listening. It's about the silent war you wage against your own doubts, your own fears, your own ingrained beliefs about what's possible. Hector was one such man, just shy of 48, a factory worker for more than half his life. You'd see him on the shop floor, often draped in the faint, metallic scent of oil and sweat, a permanent resident of the concrete labyrinth of gears and grinding steel. His work shirt, usually a faded blue or gray, was perpetually dusted with the fine grit of the machines, a second skin of labor. His face, etched with lines that spoke more of worry than of laughter, held eyes that were kind but perpetually weary, like he'd just woken from a dream he couldn't quite shake, or maybe, like he hadn't truly rested in years. They held a depth that suggested a mind always churning, always calculating, always carrying the invisible weight of things unspoken. His hands, though, his hands told a story all their own. Wide and calloused, knuckles thick as walnuts, they were a testament to decades of honest, brutal work. The skin was rough, permanently ingrained with the dark grease that no amount of scrubbing could fully remove, each scar a quiet medal earned in the unending battle against steel and time. These were hands that knew the rhythm of heavy machinery, the exact weight of a load, the precise angle to apply force. They were strong, dependable hands, capable of fixing almost anything, from a temperamental conveyor belt to a loose kitchen faucet at home. But they were also the hands of a man who held his problems tight, clenching them into fists rather than opening them up for another to see. He moved with a certain stoicism, a deliberate, slightly heavy gait, the kind of man who'd help you lift a stubbornly stuck crate without a word, his muscles flexing under his worn work shirt, then just as silently disappear back into his own thoughts, leaving you to wonder what invisible weight he was always shouldering. At the lunch break, while other men bantered about sports or argued politics, Hector would often sit a little apart, unwrapping his sandwich, his gaze drifting over the bustling floor, seeing perhaps not the machines but the years they represented. He was dependable, fiercely so, a man whose word was his bond, who never shirked a task or left a job unfinished. But that dependability came wrapped in a protective layer of reserve, a quietude that others sometimes mistook for indifference, but was, in truth, a habit born of internalizing every problem, every fear, every silent doubt. For Hector, asking for help or even just voicing a complaint felt like a confession of weakness, a crack in the sturdy facade he presented to the world and, more importantly, to himself. It was a flaw that isolated him, that left him to wrestle with his struggles alone, fueling a quiet ambition for a life with less stress, yet leaving him stuck in a constant, solitary battle with the fear of never truly being enough. The quiet solitude of Hector's mind was often broken by the screech of his alarm, a jarring cut through the pre-dawn quiet. Every weekday, without fail, it tore him from a shallow sleep at precisely 5:00 a.m. He never hit snooze. There was no point. The world outside his small, slightly worn house was still mostly dark, but the faint glow of streetlights filtered through the bedroom window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the cold air. Maria would stir beside him, a soft sigh escaping her lips, but he always slipped out of bed first, careful not to wake her fully. The smell of stale coffee from the pot left on a timer was the first greeting, a bitter, comforting aroma. He'd pour himself a mug, black, no sugar, and sit at the kitchen table, the linoleum cool against his forearms, the silence punctuated only by the hum of the refrigerator. His breakfast was always the same. A piece of toast or a bowl of cereal, eaten mechanically, his mind already drifting to the day ahead, the endless sequence of tasks. He'd pack a simple lunch, usually a sandwich, an apple, maybe a handful of chips, into a plastic container, its lid already showing cracks from years of use. Each movement was practiced, economical, imbued with the heavy grace of a man who had done the same things in the same order for decades. As he laced up his heavy work boots, he'd cast a glance at the framed photos on the dresser. Elena's beaming smile from her high school graduation, Leo's mischievous grin from a long-ago Little League game. A fleeting warmth, a surge of purpose would course through him, quickly tempered by the familiar anxiety of providing. The drive to the factory was a blur of sleepy streets and the increasing rumble of traffic as more workers emerged from their homes. He'd pull into the sprawling parking lot, a vast sea of dented pickups and faded sedans, the factory looming ahead like a metal titan, breathing out a steady plume of steam into the chilly air. Inside, the world transformed into a cacophony of grinding gears, clanging metal, and the pervasive metallic tang of oil and sweat. 8 hours, sometimes 10, often 12, Hector spent on his feet, operating a press that stamped out parts with rhythmic, skull-numbing precision. Push the button, wait for the thud, retrieve the part, inspect it, repeat. His body knew the dance. His hands moved with an almost independent intelligence, calloused and strong, yet the sheer monotony of it seeped into his bones, leaching the color from his days. It was a life lived in increments, by the clock-in, the lunch whistle, the final bell. Evenings offered a brief reprieve, a chance to shed the grime and the mental dullness of the factory floor. Maria would greet him with a gentle smile, asking about his day, and he'd offer a grunt or a brief summary, never burdening her with the full weight of it. Elena, with her quick mind and growing independence, would often be lost in her studies, while Leo, all raw energy, would be rattling through the house. Dinner was a precious island of family togetherness, but even then, Hector's weariness was a silent guest at the table. Later, perched on the worn armchair, watching the flickering blue light of the television with Maria, his mind would inevitably drift to the numbers. The roof still needed repair, a constant, nagging worry every time it rained. The car was making a new, ominous sound. And then there was Elena's college. Every letter, every brochure, every hushed conversation with Maria about tuition fees felt like a fresh application of pressure, tightening the band around his chest. He worked hard, harder than most, yet the finish line seemed to perpetually recede, a mirage in the desert of his daily grind. Beneath the surface of this quiet, dependable man churned a relentless current of buried dreams and anxieties. He was haunted by the phantom of a younger Hector, a man who, in his 20s, had imagined a different life. Not a life of luxury, never that, but one with more breathing room, more control, perhaps even a small business, something built with his own hands and his own ideas, not just his brute strength. He dabbled once years ago in fixing engines in his garage, dreaming of opening a small repair shop, but the capital, the risk, the sheer unknown had felt like insurmountable cliffs. Life, he'd told himself, had just happened. The factory job was stable. The bills needed paying. Responsibility weighed more than ambition. Now that gap between who he was and who he had wanted to be felt like a yawning chasm, filled with the ghosts of opportunities not taken. He saw obstacles everywhere not as challenges to overcome, but as immovable walls that defined his boundaries. It wasn't his fault, he reasoned, not really. It was the economy, the way things were, the bad luck of the draw. His parents had worked hard, his grandparents had worked hard, and this was just how it was for men like them. This passive acceptance had become a heavy cloak, insulating him from the sharper pangs of regret but also suffocating any impulse to change. It drained his mental energy, trapped him in a cycle of blaming external factors. The boss, the system, fate itself, for his stress and lack of progress, making him feel like a victim of circumstances beyond his control. That belief that everything was simply his lot kept him from even looking for solutions, cementing his isolation and feeding the quiet, persistent fear that no matter how hard he toiled, he would never truly be enough for the family he loved more than life itself. Then came the letter. Not a bill, not a notice, but an envelope from the state university, thick and promising, addressed to Elena. Hector was at the kitchen table, nursing a lukewarm coffee before his afternoon shift, when Maria called him from the living room, her voice a little higher than usual. Elena stood beside her, hands clasped, eyes wide with a fragile hope that was both beautiful and terrifying. "It's here, Papa," Elena whispered, holding the envelope as if it contained glass. Hector took it, his big hands surprisingly gentle as he tore open the flap. Inside, a glossy brochure, an acceptance certificate, and then the financial aid package. He skimmed the first 2 pages, a warmth spreading through him at the sight of Elena's name, the congratulations, the dreams that felt suddenly within reach. She was grinning now, a pure, unburdened smile that Hector hadn't seen in years, not since she was a little girl chasing butterflies in the park. But then his eyes landed on the numbers on the 3rd page. Scholarships, grants, good, better than he'd expected. But the total, the remaining balance, the gap that still stretched between their reality and her dream, it hit him like a physical blow. His jaw tightened, the numbers blurred. He felt the blood drain from his face, a cold knot forming in his stomach. The figure wasn't impossible, not entirely, but it was a mountain he hadn't prepared for, a mountain that felt utterly insurmountable given his fixed mindset. Papa. Alina's voice was softer now, a tremor in it. The light in her eyes, that hopeful flicker, began to dim, almost imperceptibly at first, like a candle catching a draft. She was watching his face, reading the truth there before he even uttered a word. She always had been too perceptive. He tried to force a smile, a meaningless grunt of reassurance, but his lips felt stiff, his tongue heavy. It's good, Mija. Very good." He couldn't meet her gaze. He looked at the paper again, searching for something, anything he'd missed, a hidden line item, a magic number that would make it all work. There was nothing, just the cold, hard math. He could feel Maria's worried eyes on him, too, silent and understanding. Alina slowly reached out and took the letter from his hand. She read the final figures and the smile vanished completely. Her shoulders slumped. The light in her eyes extinguished itself, replaced by a dull, familiar disappointment that mirrored his own. It was the look of a child who'd just been told Santa wasn't real, only this was real, and it was her future. Her gaze dropped to the floor, her dreams shrinking before his very eyes. The unspoken question hung in the air. So, no then? He couldn't say it. The word caught in his throat, a suffocating lump. Seeing that flicker of hope dim in her eyes, realizing his passive mindset wasn't just affecting him but actively limiting his children's future, was a blade twisting in his gut. The thought of telling her no, because he hadn't pushed harder, because he had simply accepted his lot, was unbearable. It wasn't about the money anymore. It was about the failure of his own will. That night, Hector couldn't sleep. He lay beside Maria, listening to her soft, even breathing, the house utterly silent except for the hum of the old refrigerator in the kitchen. At 3 a.m., he gave up, carefully sliding out of bed so as not to wake her. The floorboards creaked under his weight. He made his way to the kitchen, the acceptance letter and financial aid forms still lying on the table under the dim glow of the stovetop light. He sat down, the worn vinyl cool beneath his forearms. He picked up the letter again, the glossy paper feeling like a condemnation in his hands. Every number, every word of congratulations felt like a cruel joke. "You're good enough, Alina. Your father is." The brutal honesty of the pre-dawn hours stripped away all his usual defenses. No more blaming the economy or the factory or fate. This wasn't fate, this was him. What had his life become? A cycle. Wake, work, bills, sleep. Repeat. He told himself it was responsibility, being a provider. But what kind of provider was he if he couldn't even give his daughter the chance she'd earned? He pictured Alina's face, not just tonight, but all the times he'd seen that same quiet resignation in her eyes, in Leo's, in Maria's, because he hadn't been able to provide more, do more, be more. The new roof the house needed, the worn-out tires on the family car, the way Maria sometimes looked at the grocery bill, sighing. It wasn't just about Alina's college. It was about all of it. He thought of the dreams he'd buried, the engine repair shop, the quiet ambition for a life with less stress. He'd let them wither, telling himself he wasn't good enough, smart enough, brave enough. He'd convinced himself that asking for help was a weakness, that complaining was useless. So he'd internalized it all, let it fester, turning every obstacle into an excuse. He saw himself now clearly for the first time in years. A man trapped not by circumstance, but by his own mind. His deep-seated fear of never being enough for his family wasn't just a fear. It was a self-fulfilling prophecy. He had been so busy avoiding the pain of trying and failing, he hadn't even truly tried. He had believed his circumstances were fixed, and in doing so, he had fixed them himself. This passive acceptance, this quiet victimhood had drained him, kept him from seeing solutions, kept him from fighting. It had kept him silent, isolated, and small. A wave of profound shame washed over him, a cold, bitter taste in his mouth. He squeezed his eyes shut, the pressure behind them burning. He was failing his kids, not because he didn't love them enough, but because he hadn't fought enough. He hadn't fought for himself, and now he hadn't fought for them. The silence of the house pressed in around him, heavy with the weight of years of unspoken regrets and unfulfilled potential. This wasn't just a tough spot. This was the precipice of everything he held dear. He had to face it. The problem wasn't out there. The problem was right here in his own head. Then came the letter. Not just any letter, but the one Alina had been talking about since freshman year. State University. Her dream. He'd seen her poring over the brochures, highlighting courses, dreaming aloud about dorm life and new possibilities. Hector, like always, had listened, nodded, offered quiet encouragement, all the while a knot of dread tightening in his stomach. He knew the numbers. He knew their budget. One Tuesday evening, the school bus dropped Alina off, and she practically floated up the driveway, a thick envelope clutched in her hand. Her face was flushed, her eyes alight with a hope Hector hadn't seen burn so brightly in years, maybe ever, not even in himself. "It's here," she practically sang, pushing open the front door. Maria came rushing from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. Leo, usually glued to his gaming console, even emerged, a rare moment of family unity sparked by the sheer wattage of Alina's excitement. They gathered around the kitchen table, the linoleum worn smooth in spots just as they had for countless family dinners. But this felt different, sacred. Hector tried to project calm, a reassuring smile, but his pulse hammered against his ribs. He felt the tremor in Alina's hands as she tore open the seal, the heavy paper crinkling. First, the acceptance letter. "Congratulations!" It began bold and official, a collective gasp of joy, a small cheer from Leo, Maria's hand flying to her mouth. Alina's smile could have lit up the whole block. She handed the letter to Hector, her eyes shining. Pride swelled in him, a potent, almost forgotten feeling. His daughter, bright, focused, going places. Then she unfolded the financial aid package. The numbers were clear, stark, unforgiving. The tuition, the housing, the fees, a towering mountain. And below it, the aid offered, a measly hillock that barely made a dent. It was a good scholarship, for sure, a testament to her hard work, but not enough. Not even close. Hector's breath hitched. He saw Alina's face, the light slowly, painfully dimming in her eyes. The way she tried to hide it, a quick blink, a slight tremor of her lip, a shadow falling over her radiant face. She crumpled the paper slightly, not in anger, but in a silent, heartbreaking acknowledgement of defeat. "Oh," was all she whispered, the single word a deflating sigh. In that instant, watching the hope drain from his daughter's eyes, Hector felt a deeper chill than any winter morning in the factory. It wasn't just disappointment. It was the active, visible shattering of a dream, and he knew with a gut-wrenching certainty that his own passive acceptance, his own quiet resignation to how things were, had led them here. The thought of telling her no, of being the one to extinguish that beautiful spark because he hadn't pushed harder, hadn't fought more, hadn't changed his own damn mindset was unbearable. It clawed at his throat, a silent scream. He mumbled something about looking it over, about figuring something out, but the words tasted like ash. Alina nodded, a forced, brittle smile on her face, and excused herself, disappearing into her room. The silence she left behind was louder than any argument. Maria looked at him, her own face etched with worry, a silent question in her eyes that Hector couldn't answer. Not yet. He stayed up late that night, long after Maria and the kids had gone to bed. The house grew quiet, settling into its familiar creaks and groans. But Hector couldn't settle. He lay there, staring at the darkened ceiling, the numbers from the financial aid letter burning behind his eyelids. At 3 a.m., the old digital clock on the nightstand glowed green, mocking him. He slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Maria, whose soft breathing was the only sound in the room. He went to the living room, the worn armchair calling to him. He sank into it, the fabric familiar, comforting in its age, but today it offered no solace. The moonlight, pale and cold, streamed through the blinds, casting striped shadows across the threadbare rug. He looked at his hands, calloused, scarred from years of gripping tools, pushing buttons, moving levers. Hands that had built other men's fortunes, but what had they built for him? For his family. His life flashed before him, not in a grand, cinematic sweep, but in a series of mundane, repetitive images. The 5 a.m. alarm, the lukewarm coffee, the endless line, the drone of machinery, the bills piled high on the kitchen counter, the perpetually needing a new roof house. He saw the dreams he'd buried, the ambitions he'd let wither, not because he was incapable, but because he'd told himself he was. He'd convinced himself that asking for help was weakness, that complaining was useless, that his lot was simply to endure. And now, Alina, that look in her eyes, that crushed hope, it was a mirror of his own defeat, magnified, made tangible in his daughter's pain. The shame was a physical weight, pressing down on his chest until it was hard to breathe. He had always feared not being enough, and tonight he was actively proving it. He had been so busy avoiding the pain of trying and failing, he hadn't even truly tried. He had believed his circumstances were fixed, and in doing so, he had fixed them himself. He replayed conversations in his head, the ones he hadn't had, the arguments he hadn't made, the opportunities he hadn't seized. He felt like a coward. His internal narrative, that whispered voice of self-doubt and passive acceptance, had been his greatest liability. He had been so focused on external obstacles that he had completely neglected the enemy within. He had to stop lying to himself. This wasn't just bad luck. This was a choice he had made every single day to be less than he could be, to not fight, to not strive. And that choice had led directly to the dimming light in his daughter's eyes. The problem wasn't out there. It was right here in his own head. He wasn't failing his kids because he didn't love them enough, but because he hadn't fought enough. He hadn't fought for himself, and now he hadn't fought for them. The thought twisted in his gut, raw and brutal. His passive mindset wasn't just affecting him, it was actively limiting his children's future. He had become a victim of his own environment, of his own fate, and that had drained his mental energy, kept him from finding solutions, kept him silent, isolated, and small. A wave of profound shame, cold and bitter, washed over him again. He was at the precipice. This wasn't just a tough spot. This was the moment he had to decide if he would let his fear define his family's future. The clock on the wall above the kitchen sink ticked louder than usual, each beat a hammer blow against the silence of his failure. Hector sat there long after Maria and the kids had gone to bed, the untouched coffee cup growing cold beside him. He stared at the worn linoleum floor, but he didn't see the scuffs or the faded pattern. He saw a road that stretched behind him, a road paved with quiet compromises, with unspoken apologies to himself, with opportunities he'd simply watched roll by. "Enough!" he whispered, the word barely a breath. It wasn't a shout of anger, not a dramatic fist slam. It was something far deeper, heavier. A weariness so profound it had become a kind of bedrock. He was tired. Tired of being scared. Tired of the knot in his stomach every time a bill arrived. Tired of the excuses he told himself, the ones that blamed everything and everyone but the man in the mirror. For years, that man had let life happen to him. He'd accepted his lot, swallowed his pride, and convinced himself that survival was success. But watching the light dim in Alina's eyes, that was a different kind of failure. That was choosing to let his fear actively limit her future. And in that moment, in the cold, quiet kitchen, a silent line was drawn. He didn't know what came next. He had no grand plan, no sudden flash of genius. He just knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that he couldn't keep going like this. This passive acceptance, this quiet resignation, this deep-seated belief that he was enough, it had to end. The sun, a pale, reluctant stripe, eventually found its way through the kitchen window. The alarm clock, a familiar tormentor, buzzed at 5 a.m. Hector dragged himself out of bed. His body remembered the drill, the years of rote movement. Shower, instant coffee, toast. The factory floor awaited another 10 hours of noise and repetition. But today, something was different. The air didn't smell like opportunity, didn't feel lighter, but inside his chest, a tiny, unfamiliar spark flickered. It wasn't hope yet, not really. More like a stubborn refusal to extinguish. He went through the motions of his morning ritual, but his mind wasn't on the usual worries. It kept returning to Alina, to the crumpled acceptance letter on the fridge, to the numbers on the financial aid statement that had seemed so insurmountable. Usually he'd glance at it, sigh, and put it out of his mind, another problem for another day, or perhaps for never. But today, a quiet voice, a new one, insisted he look again. He finished his coffee, the bitter taste grounding him. Instead of heading for his lunch bag by the door, a familiar routine that offered the comfort of predictability, he walked back to the fridge. His fingers hesitated over the magnet holding the letter, a piece of paper that held both a dream and a nightmare. Taking a deep breath, he pulled it down. He unfolded it carefully, as if handling something fragile and precious, which it was. He read it again, not skimming this time, but dissecting every word, every line, every paragraph. The tuition cost, the aid offered, the gaping hole that remained. His old self would have felt the familiar, suffocating weight of despair, the tightening in his chest, the dull ache of resignation. His old self would have folded it back up, muttered, "Impossible!" and let it sink into the abyss of unfixable problems, another dream too expensive for the likes of them. But today he made himself focus. He forced his eyes to see beyond the initial shock, beyond the immediate feeling of failure. This was the first test of his new resolve, a tiny, almost imperceptible flexing of a muscle he hadn't known he possessed, mental toughness. It wasn't about being smart or having resources. It was about the simple, stubborn choice to not look away. The furnace of his mind, usually stoked with blame and self-pity, was now directed at the problem. What did each line mean? Were there clauses he'd missed? Options he hadn't considered? Smaller grants? Payment plans? He didn't have answers, not yet. But he wasn't looking away. He was engaging. This was uncomfortable, intensely so. It felt like picking at an old, festering wound. Every instinct screamed to retreat, to just go to work, to bury his head in the familiar, comforting noise of the machinery. But he pushed past it. He kept reading. He opened his laptop, a relic he mostly used for bills and YouTube, and for the first time, with a tremor in his fingers, he typed, "State University Financial Aid Appeals," into the search bar. The screen glowed, a terrifying, beautiful blank slate, full of infinite possibilities and overwhelming complexity. He didn't know what he was doing, not really, but he was doing something. He was pushing through the mental resistance, refusing to let the discomfort win, refusing to let that inner voice whisper, "Give up." This was day one. It was messy. It was terrifying, but he didn't stop. He made a note, a single bullet point on a scrap of paper. Call financial aid office. A tiny, terrifying commitment. The first call to the financial aid office on day 3 felt like trying to punch smoke. He navigated automated menus that coiled back on themselves like angry snakes, pressing numbers, listening to tinny music, then being disconnected. The frustration, hot and familiar, bubbled up. It had been years since he'd really tried to fight for something like this, not just endure it. His default reaction was to sigh, to shrug, to tell himself, "See, Hector, this is why you don't bother." The phone felt heavy in his hand, a dead weight urging him to put it down, to surrender. He pictured Alina's hopeful face, saw the dimming light in her eyes from before. He clenched his jaw, took a deep breath that tasted of stale air and defeat, and dialed again. And again. And again. Finally, after what felt like an hour, a human voice answered, flat and bored, and spoke in a language of institutional jargon that made his head spin. He got nowhere, not really. Just a vague instruction to check the university portal for appeals procedures. Another dead end, another brick wall. He hung up, defeated, but didn't give up. Not yet. He wrote down the new instruction, a slightly more detailed bullet point. Progress, however microscopic, was still progress. By day 7, the initial surge of defiant energy had worn thin, replaced by a dull ache behind his eyes and a pervasive sense of futility. He'd spent every evening after work hunched over his worn laptop, the screen a dizzying blur of PDFs and FAQs. The appeals form itself was a monstrous document, asking for details he didn't even know he had. Income projections, assets, liabilities, extenuating circumstances. Each field felt like a judgment, a glaring spotlight on his modest life. He caught himself staring blankly at the wall, the old numbness threatening to reclaim him. His shoulders slumped. Maria, bustling around the kitchen, would glance at him, a flicker of concern in her eyes. "To do bien, Hector?" she'd ask. She. He'd mumble, not wanting to burden her, not wanting to admit how hopelessly out of his depth he felt. The factory floor, with its predictable grind, suddenly felt like a haven from the chaos in his mind. There, he knew what to do. Here, in the quiet of his living room, he was adrift. He wanted to scream. He wanted to just close the laptop, put on the TV, and forget about it all. The voice inside him, the old, comfortable voice of resignation, whispered, "This is too hard. You're not smart enough for this. Just tell her no. It's fine." But then he'd think of Alina, humming quietly to herself as she studied, her future an open book she was so ready to write. He thought of Leo, energetic and full of questions, looking up to his father with an unshakable faith. He couldn't go back to being the man who just accepted his lot. He couldn't be the man who told his children their dreams were too expensive. With a grunt, he'd push himself upright, stretch his stiff neck, and force his eyes back to the glowing screen. He'd highlight a confusing paragraph, search for definitions, even if it meant an extra hour of squinting into the small hours of the morning. He made small breakthroughs, identifying a specific income adjustment form, finding an obscure scholarship fund for first-generation college students. Each tiny step felt like pulling a boulder uphill. He went to bed utterly exhausted, but with a different kind of exhaustion than before. It wasn't the weary acceptance of a day endured, but the bone-deep fatigue of a battle fought, however small. 2 weeks in, the full weight of the challenge pressed down on him. Day 14 felt like day 100. He desubmitted the first round of the appeal, painstakingly filling out every box, attaching every supporting document he could muster, tax returns, pay stubs, medical bills. He'd even swallowed his pride and called his brother-in-law, a small business owner, for advice on structuring some of the financial details. The reply had come back a few days ago. A polite, formal letter stating that his appeal was denied due to insufficient justification. A single, cold paragraph that felt like a punch to the gut. All that effort, all those late nights, all that mental wrestling for nothing. The old Hector would have crumpled right there. He would have held that letter in his hand, looked at the neat, impersonal words, and felt his world shrink. He would have said, Well, I tried. Can't say I didn't. He would have thrown the letter in the trash and started practicing how to tell Alina the bad news, wrapping it in platitudes about things not always working out. But the new Hector, still bruised and battered, looked at the words again. Insufficient justification. It wasn't no. It was not enough. A subtle but profound difference. It meant there was justification, he just hadn't found it or articulated it properly. He felt the familiar surge of self-doubt, the cold knot of fear that whispered, "You're not good enough. You never were." He closed his eyes, took a ragged breath. He could still taste the metallic tang of fear and frustration. He almost gave up. He really, truly almost did. He sat there, the crumpled denial letter in his hand, for what felt like an eternity. He stared at the worn kitchen table, then at the chipped paint on the wall. He thought about the factory, the endless rhythm, the small, known world. He thought about giving up on this new, terrifying fight. But then another image flashed in his mind, sharp and clear. Alina's face, not as it was when the acceptance letter came, but as it was when she was a little girl holding his hand, utterly trusting. And he knew. He couldn't look away from that. He couldn't tell her he hadn't tried everything. He picked up the letter again, his fingers tracing the cold type. Insufficient justification. He needed more. He needed to find what was sufficient. He pulled out the original aid package, the appeal form, and the denial letter. He spread them all out on the table, a battlefield of bureaucracy. There was another way. There had to be. He just hadn't found it yet. His eyes were burning, his mind was screaming for rest, but something inside him, a stubborn, unyielding spark, refused to let him quit. He would keep going. That night and the nights that followed were a blur of forms, footnotes, and fine print. Hector, the man who'd learned to accept no as the end of a conversation, now treated it like the beginning of an interrogation. He called the university's financial aid office, not once, not twice, but half a dozen times. Each time he got a different student worker, a different piece of the puzzle. He learned to rephrase his questions, to dig deeper than the canned responses. He started keeping a notebook, a cheap spiral-bound thing from the dollar store, filled with names, dates, and snippets of advice. He found out about scholarships he'd never heard of, obscure grants tied to specific fields of study, or even hometowns. He uncovered clauses in the original financial aid package that could be reevaluated under extenuating circumstances. His initial attempts were clumsy, full of the old Hector's hesitation. He'd mumble, apologize, feel the heat rising in his neck. But then he'd remember Alina's face, the fading light in her eyes, and a different kind of strength would settle in him. It wasn't anger. It was a cold, quiet resolve. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, things began to shift. The first sign was at work. Old man Jenkins, the foreman, a crusty veteran who hadn't smiled since '98, usually got Hector's standard blank stare when he complained about the new machine. But one Tuesday, when the hydraulic press started seizing up again, Hector didn't just stand there waiting for instructions. He walked over, tools in hand, and started checking the pressure gauge, then the fluid lines, tracing the problem with a focused intensity Jenkins hadn't seen in him before. He didn't fix it right away, but he didn't give up. He stayed with it, looking up diagrams in the break room, talking to the younger guys who were always fiddling with their phones until he had a theory. Jenkins just watched, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. At home, Maria noticed it first. Hector was still quiet, that much hadn't changed, but he wasn't distant. Before he'd come home, eat, and retreat into the television or his own head, 1,000 unspoken worries weighing him down. Now he'd be at the kitchen table late into the night, but he wasn't just staring at bills. He was writing, researching, talking on the phone in low, serious tones. When Alina came down for a glass of water, she'd see him poring over financial documents, highlighters and pens spread across the surface. He wasn't giving up. He was working. One evening, Leo, Hector's youngest, dropped a soccer ball right through the old shed window. Before, Hector would have sighed, maybe yelled a bit, then grudgingly nailed a piece of plywood over it and let it fester. This time, he looked at the shattered glass, then at Leo's mortified face. He didn't raise his voice. "All right, buddy," he said, and there was a calm, almost curious note in his tone. "Looks like we got ourselves a project. Go grab the tape measure. We're gonna need to figure out the dimensions, then we can look up how much a new pane costs and maybe watch a video on how to put it in." Leo, expecting a lecture, just blinked. Hector wasn't just fixing a window, he was teaching a process, a solution-oriented approach that had been absent before. The change wasn't a sudden burst of sunshine. It was like the slow dawn after a long, dark night. Hope, not the naive kind, but a grittier, more earned hope, began to seep back into their modest house. Hector started seeing the worn-out roof not just as a financial burden, but as a problem with a defined solution, an item that could be broken down into steps. Research materials, get quotes, maybe even learn to do part of it himself. He hadn't bought a single shingle yet, but he had a plan, a timeline, a growing understanding. Weeks rolled into months. Hector still worked the factory floor, the same noise, the same machines. But the man moving amongst them was different. His shoulders were still broad from years of manual labor, his hands calloused. Yet his gaze wasn't fixed on the ground anymore. He looked up, made eye contact. He asked questions. He even shared ideas with his supervisor about improving a bottleneck on the assembly line, something the old Hector would have dismissed as, "Not my job," or, "They won't listen." Wasn't trying to climb the corporate ladder. He was just trying to do his job better, more efficiently, because he realized efficiency was just another way of solving a problem. The financial aid struggle was far from over, but it was moving. Hector had rewritten the appeal letter 3 times, each version stronger, more detailed, supported by newfound evidence of their financial strain and Alina's academic merit. He had contacted every local community scholarship fund he could find. Even set up a meeting with a financial advisor from a nonprofit, something he would have been too proud or too intimidated to do before. He wasn't just hoping for a different outcome, he was making a different outcome. He had taken his internal narrative, the one that whispered, "You're not enough," and slowly, painstakingly rewritten it. He was enough. He just had to keep proving it to himself, one stubborn, determined step at a time. Maria noticed it first, as wives often do. It wasn't a grand declaration, no sudden epiphany shouted across the dinner table. It was smaller, quieter. He'd come home from work, still tired, sure, but the weariness no longer clung to him like a shroud. He'd eat his dinner not in silence, but with an ear open to the day's chatter, Alina talking about her calculus, Leo's latest video game conquest. Sometimes he'd even offer a wry comment, a small smile playing on his lips, a genuine one that reached his eyes. The tension that had etched itself into the corners of his mouth seemed to soften day by day, like old concrete finally giving way to persistent rain. One evening, Leo was wrestling with a tricky math problem for school, his brow furrowed in frustration. The old Hector would have grunted, maybe offered a vague, "Figure it out," or retreated behind his newspaper. But this new Hector, he pulled up a chair, didn't just give the answer, no. He leaned over the page, his calloused finger tracing the numbers, patiently asking questions. "What do you think is going on here, Mijo? What's the problem trying to tell you?" He guided Leo through the logic, not just the arithmetic, until a light of understanding flickered in his son's eyes. Maria watched from the kitchen, a quiet warmth spreading through her chest. It wasn't just about the math, it was about connection, about presence. Hector was there. The atmosphere in the house shifted, subtle as the changing seasons. The air, once thick with unspoken worries, felt lighter. Arguments were still arguments, bills were still bills, but the underlying current of helplessness that had always seemed to drag them down began to dissipate. Alina, immersed in her college applications and the daunting financial reality, caught glimpses of this new resolve in her father. He was still quiet, but now his quietness felt less like resignation and more like focused determination. He'd pull out the financial aid forms late at night, a penlight clipped to his reading glasses, poring over every line, every possible loophole. He wasn't complaining about the unfairness, he was dissecting the problem. Then came the day. A thick envelope, adorned with the university's crest, arrived in the mail. Alina, her hands trembling, ripped it open. She read, then reread, her eyes scanning for the dreaded, insufficient funds. But it wasn't there. Not exactly. It was a revised offer, a new scholarship, a special grant for students demonstrating exceptional merit and need, pieced together from Hector's persistent calls, his meticulously crafted letters, and that meeting with the nonprofit advisor. It wasn't a full ride, not by a long shot. There would still be loans, still sacrifices, but it was possible. Alina looked up, tears welling in her eyes, not of sadness, but of pure, unadulterated relief and joy. "Papa," she whispered, "I can go. I can actually go." Hector stood there, his own eyes a little misty. He didn't say much, just nodded, a small, proud smile gracing his lips. He hadn't just changed their circumstances. He had changed the narrative playing out in his daughter's head, the one that had started to whisper that her dreams were too big for their reality. Had rewritten it. Weeks later, the factory floor still hummed with the same relentless rhythm, the machines still demanded attention. But Hector moved with a different kind of purpose. He started taking evening classes at the community college, learning about basic electrical repairs, something he'd always wanted to do but deemed unnecessary for a factory man. He wasn't aiming for a promotion, not directly. He just wanted to understand more to be capable of more. He found a quiet satisfaction in mastering a new skill, in watching his own brain grasp concepts it once dismissed as too complicated. He remembered the old him, the man who saw obstacles as giant, unmoving walls. The man who just lowered his head and pushed, hoping to brute force his way through life, or more often, just surrender to the current. He realized now that those walls were often just puzzles. And his greatest opponent wasn't the economy or the boss or fate, it was the voice inside his head. The one that said, "You can't." The one that said, "It's too hard." The one that said, "You're not smart enough, not strong enough, not enough." He was sitting on his porch one warm evening, the new porch light he'd wired himself casting a soft glow. Elena was FaceTiming a friend from her dorm room. Leo was kicking a soccer ball in the yard. Maria sat beside him, gently swaying in the old swing. "You know," he started, his voice a low rumble, "for a long time I just let things happen to me, figured that was my lot in life. You work hard, you keep your head down, you deal with what comes. Obstacles. They were just proof that life was unfair, proof I wasn't meant for more." He paused, watching a firefly blink in the twilight. But then I saw Elena's face, the hope dimming in her eyes over that college letter, and it hit me. I couldn't keep doing that. I couldn't let my own damn mindset limit her future, limit our future. It ain't about how strong your back is or how much money you got in the bank, not really. It's about what you tell yourself up here. He tapped his temple. It's about choosing your response every single time things get hard. It's about deciding you're gonna figure it out no matter what. You pick yourself up, you dust yourself off, and you try again. Maybe a different way, maybe 100 different ways. That's the real difference between just getting by and actually getting somewhere. It's not about being fearless. It's about being scared and doing it anyway. Maria reached over and took his calloused hand, squeezing it gently. He looked at her, a knowing warmth passing between them. He was still Hector, the factory man, the husband, the father. But he was also something more. He was a man who had wrestled his inner demons, not into submission, but into a truce, a working relationship where he was firmly in charge. He understood now that mental toughness wasn't about being emotionless, but about actively choosing his response to adversity.